So I'm finally getting around to this episode. I always intended to review it in the first place, but with the series still airing when I initially got around to it, I was put off because of the heavy subject matter, and worried that I would have to do a good chunk of research to get a decent grasp of the whole thing. With the passage of time, I realised that it's not anywhere near as serious as that. Series 11, as a whole, by and large, didn't carry on with the same kind of heavy subject matter. Most notably, it was followed by Arachnids in the UK a week after, which exposed the series' grasp on political nuance to be at the very worst, laughable. Basically, I'm not worried about making people angry and starting a flame war in the comment section, which nobody uses. I'm here to review this episode as a work of fiction and drama, rather than discuss the political climate around it. Having said all that, let's see how it goes. If this episode hadn't have had the huge, glaring, painful problems it has, it could have been one of the best in the series. Look, considering the quality of the whole series, that isn't saying much. What I'm trying to get at is the foundation of this episode is solid. It's more consistent and focused than many of its sibling episodes, but it's just completely held down by all the aforementioned issues. And if you watch my other reviews, said issues will be no stranger to you. The episode is about the doctoring gang in 1955 Montgomery, Alabama, where they have to stop a meddling racist from changing the future. Along the way, they meet another celebrity historical figure in Rosa Parks, as well as many more wonderful and pleasant characters. The episode paces itself well and gives lots of opportunities for characters and events to take place. It's almost impressive that it was able to cram the amount of stuff it has in the episode and not make moments feel too wasted. There were a couple of areas where the episode could have done with trimming the fat, like the motel scene and the epilogue. More on those in a bit. But for the most part, it kept my attention enough to the point where I wasn't bored or overwhelmed like I was with the other episodes. I liked the aesthetic. It was a much more vibrant and colourful location than the dull and dry desert and the dark and depressing tunnels in the previous episode. It reminds me of my time playing Mafia 2. There are a lot of similarities given the time period presented. I just wish we could see more of it. Too often is the camera zoomed in and focused on the characters, leaving the background almost totally blurred out. Not to mention the amounts of cuts and camera shifts never give you enough time to appreciate or even notice the scenery most of the time. I like the composition of this scene. Not the scene itself, the scene is just fine. I just like the shot here. I liked how the episode recreated historical figures from the past. Just wish they were focused on a bit more. I'll get back to this as well. I appreciate how all the main characters contributed to the plot. Yes, even Yaz. In fact, I think Yaz has more dialogue in this episode than she does in the entire rest of the series. Each of them was able to use their skills to solve their predicament. Along with everyone getting involved, does mean there'd be a lot of dialogue. Now normally I would get very annoyed with obnoxious amount of talking, but this episode thankfully didn't feel so bloated. Probably due to everything that was being said being coherent. Mostly. Lastly, for what it's worth, I'm pretty impressed on how the episode deals with racism. The episode doesn't shy away from showing off extreme cases of discrimination, and in a family show that's commendable. Especially when you consider the meddling of real history the BBC has unfortunately become infamous for. Oh, and this line is genuinely funny.
We were in Rosa Parks' class in primary. Do you remember?
She's the boss woman, right?
You do remember what she did?
Yeah. First black woman to ever drive a bus.
No.
I'll admit, that's a lot of positives. More praise than most episodes this series has been graced with. A common trend with this series, though, is that for every positive I find, there has to be an average of about, say, 4 or more terrible things to go along with it. I know I just praised the episode on how they didn't shy away from heavy discrimination, but it's still rather undeveloped. By that I mean, it's all treated rather one-sided. It's presented as if every single white person that isn't the Doctor or Graham treated every single coloured person the exact same deplorable way. Now, I don't deny this didn't happen in America back then, but to treat every white person as the bad guy devalues the few people who were respectful and supported the civil rights movement. There's never an attempt to show off anyone who's indifferent to coloured people. I'm bringing this up because I don't get the feeling that this was the episode's intention, but the fact that it gives off a good guy, bad guy vibe is kind of a problem. I get why they did this though. The discrimination against Ryan and Yaz at the beginning of the episode was to give you a sense of what it was like in America back then.
Y'all need to eat somewhere else. Come on.
Who was that?
The problem is that it persists throughout the whole episode. I guess my gripe is that all the episode had to do to solve this was at least mention some good or respectful white people in the time period. Then it wouldn't feel so personal. Obviously, I'm not saying the episode should present racist people in a positive or sympathetic light, but I think there's valuable nuances in the topic that are overlooked by presenting everything so simplistically. For as big a problem as the episode presents racism to be, it doesn't really do anything to improve people's understanding of racism. There's little to nothing here, for example, about why people develop racist attitudes, why the law enforced it, or the history behind the US racial relations of the period. I guess because the answer to that is very complicated, but if you want to make a story like this, it's kind of necessary, especially if you're going for a more educational show. Without that, all you get is people being racist for the sake of people being racist. A bit like Krasko then. Krasko is this week's villain, and he's not very good. Krasko is a racist time traveller who's trying to change the future by making Rosa not protest staying on that bus that happened that one time. Because he really hates black people. I've heard many people say that Krasko is undeveloped, and while I agree with that, it's much worse than that. The problem is that not only is Krasko undeveloped, he doesn't work. Throughout the whole episode, we learn barely anything from him, and what little we do learn only raises more questions. The most we learn about Krasko is that he was a neutered criminal released from the Stormcage facility, some, 3,000, 6,000 years in the future? I can only guess, but Stormcage was the same prison River Song was sent to in the previous series, so I guess it's nice that this series was able to reference something to ensure that fans are still watching the same show. But given that, we know Stormcage operates in River Song's native time period of the 51st century, and Krasko is probably from that same time period as well, or at least from thousands of years in the future. By that point, in-universe, humans have had centuries to work together, had numerous cases of alien contact, and have already flown out to space to colonize planets. Arguably, racism still exists between other species by that point. But I can't see how Krasko, or any human for that matter, would have a prejudice against black people in the 51st century. Call me an optimist, but I'd like to think we'd be done with this issue in 3,000 years' time. At the very least, I cannot see what Krasko would have to gain in his distant native millennium by averting the civil rights movement. The more you think about Krasko's motives and end goals from what little we can glean, the more unbelievable it all becomes. But it also completely undermines the cause of Rosa and the civil rights movement itself. For Rosa to refuse to get off the bus, only for racism to still exist almost 3,000 years in the future, must feel a little disappointing. Maybe someone else would argue that racism will never go away, and it's something we should be vigilant of, even 3,000 years from now. Perhaps, you and I will never know. But the issue here is the work of drama in question. I don't know anything about this character or what he wants. There's no attempt to explore why Krasko is the way he is, or how he even got to this point in his life. Whether something traumatic happened to him, or he's just sick in the head, we don't know. If they had developed or even hinted as to why Krasko would mass murder to the point of forgetting how much people he killed, it could have been believable. But we're left with a villain whose motivations are a mystery. And it's to the story's detriment, given that I'm here struggling to reconcile exactly what he thinks he's trying to do. What's the point in Krasko? What are we meant to learn from him? That racism is bad? Of course it's bad. Anyone with any credibility knows racism is bad. Even many racists know racism is bad. And those who don't aren't going to change their ways after watching Krasko. The episode is far more interested in showing off what Rosa Parks accomplished, which is perfectly fine, but when moments that could be focused on Rosa are sidelined for scenes with a character that offers the episode nothing more than a typical, generic plot obstacle, it hurts the episode greatly. If they aren't going to develop Krasko in any meaningful way, then they should have gotten their priorities straight and cut his screen time to focus more on other characters like Rosa. I quite enjoyed seeing her presented in the episode, and to its credit, I never heard of Rosa Parks before, at least I can't remember if I did, so it's nice that the episode can remind or even teach someone about a very influential and historical person in a time that's still very recent in history. I just wish there was more to her. As a character, she's likeable enough, but in terms of her personality, the episode doesn't really do very much with her. Sure, we see her at work and interacting with the main characters, but there's not a lot of depth on display, despite the obvious importance with which the episode regards her role in history. Maybe that's the kind of person Rosa was in real life, and if that's the case, fine. But was there nothing else that could have been done with her? I think the biggest problem I have with Rosa is that throughout the whole episode she is completely oblivious to the Doctor and gang being time travelers. There's never a moment where Rosa finds out or confronts the main characters about anything, despite her bumping into them several times. In fact, Rosa is often influenced and manipulated by the main characters for them to solve their time-altering problems. Sure, it's for the sake of space and time, but it feels a bit inconsiderate of the main characters for Rosa to have no clue she's being used like this. As far as I can tell, there wasn't any reason for Rosa not to know who the main characters are and what they were doing. If anything, it might have made for a better episode. At the very least, it would have given more opportunities for creative moments. Sure, it wouldn't be completely historically accurate, and you would have to make a few creative liberties, but if it makes for a more engaging and exciting character and story, then it's totally worth it. It's not like this would be a new thing. Doctor Who since the start has had an abundance of episodes set in the past, and they've met many historical celebrities, most of which that have been either strongly associated or integral to the plot. One story that springs to mind is the Series 5 episode Vincent and the Doctor, where the Doctor and Amy go back in time to meet Vincent van Gogh after discovering something strange with one of his paintings. They made Vincent integral to the story by making him the only person to be able to see a monster that no one else can. This way, we were able to learn more about Van Gogh as he ventures with the Doctor, because he is a very prominent aspect of the story. The episode doesn't shy away from showing off some very serious cases of depression that Van Gogh was sadly a victim of. It shows us a side of Van Gogh that I don't think many people really consider when thinking about his work, and because he was able to venture with the Doctor, it gives the writers tons of opportunities to get creative with him. It's one of the many reasons Doctor Who really works as a show. It allows for these sorts of stories to be told, and give people a different perspective on things. The episode Rosa doesn't appear to take advantage of this. With Rosa, it seems like they try to play it safe. Never are we shown a side of Rosa that gives you a different perspective on who she really was. Instead, it feels like they're scared to present Rosa as anything other than a normal, everyday person. Otherwise, that would dilute the overall message the episode is trying to spurt out. Maybe that was the intention, showing how anyone, even the most average of Joes, can cause such a huge change. But it doesn't make for a memorable character. Which is a shame when you realise that, though unintentional, Rosa somewhat boils down to a plot device. The way the characters scheme around Rosa and place her upon a pedestal makes her feel like less of a real person and more of an object. A MacGuffin, if you will, because the episode focuses less on who she is and instead focuses on what she did and accomplished. It seems to be assumed that the audience is already on board with who Rosa is because of what she did, but that's not how drama works. What made Rosa Parks decide enough was enough and decide to take a stand? Now, I know it was institutional racism, but beyond that, at an individual level, what drove Rosa Parks to protest against it all? The answer is obvious to the audience watching, but by the episode's end, I didn't have a much better picture of who Rosa Parks was than when the episode started. The annoying thing is that there were some good opportunities to look into this too, because we get to see Rosa Parks interact with like-minded people. Ryan at one point meets up with the leaders of the civil rights movement, including Rosa's husband and Martin Luther King. They get a total of about 3 lines and aren't shown for more than a minute. Afterwards, the scene cuts away to something else, and when the action finally returns to Rosa and Ryan, the super important meeting has ended. We don't even get to see or hear anything the group discussed. We just have to take Ryan's word of how amazing it was, which is on par with someone saying, "Man, you had to be there." Why go through the process of recreating these other historical celebrity figures if they're barely ever going to use them at all? I said I thought the pacing was fine, but there was one moment in particular where the episode completely stops dead in its tracks, for no good reason. After the Doctor and gang meet Krasko for the first time and get kicked out of a restaurant, they head to a motel, and why are you standing in a diamond formation? That's so unnatural, stop it. And no, it doesn't look good as a trailer shot either. Why are they standing like this? They decide to break in? It's implied that they keep finding signs that don't allow coloured people in their buildings, and that they've been looking for a place to hang out for a while. I'm not sure why they couldn't show that to us visually. As usual, we get a single line from Ryan on the issue.
I'm getting pretty sick of seeing that sign.
The only sign we do see outside the motel is on screen for this long. Did you get that? I didn't. My eyes were focused on the group of 4 ragtag time travellers standing in a diamond formation. So they violate the law and break into a motel room. I get that they're opposed to the race laws, but breaking and entering was illegal across the board last I checked. And they begin to plan out how they're going to stop Krasko and save the future. However, they're interrupted by a police officer. Ryan and Yaz have to hide in an alleyway, while the Doctor and Graham distract the officer from finding them. Luckily for them, the police officer is far more concerned with enforcing the segregation laws than anything prohibiting people from breaking into buildings. The only reason this scene seems to exist is to show off how coloured people were treated back in the 1950s. This might be fine if they didn't already have 2 scenes beforehand showing off exactly that. The scene drags on for so long, and you know exactly how it's going to end. You also get really stupid and condescending lines from the Doctor that just makes you roll your eyes.
You happen to know a couple of mongrels? Negro boy? Mexican girl?
I don't recognize anyone by that description.
You appreciate it's an offense to harbor coloreds in a room here.
We're not harboring anyone who doesn't have a right to be here.
Oh, we get it. Racism is bad. You've already shown us this. I know you don't have a right to be in here. You broke in. Just get back to the story. This whole moment drags on for a solid 4 minutes, long after it's made its point. Not only that, but it's then immediately followed up by a scene that tries so desperately to make you feel sorry for Yaz and Ryan as they hide in an alleyway. Ryan explains that he gets stopped by the police more than his white mates, and Yaz explains how she gets called a Paki and a terrorist. That's terrible, and it does happen to people. It's not surprising that they have this conversation in a story about racism. The problem is, it's Ryan and Yaz. I don't know who these characters are. The previous 2 episodes have done very little to develop either one of them, and, spoilers, none of the following episodes do any better of a job. Hearing them talk about the trouble they've had because of their race feels very disingenuous. At no point before or after this episode do we see them experiencing any of these hardships. Chalk this up as yet another example of this series' extreme version of show don't tell. Remember when Ryan went on about how amazing that meeting we never saw was? Well, here the same principles apply. I can't care about something just because you tell me I should care about it. The writers are only having these to discuss their race because this particular story called for it, not because of who these characters are as people. Like I say, it goes nowhere, never to be brought up again for the rest of the series. After the police officer leaves, the scene just goes on as if nothing happened. That's 4 whole minutes of just nothing important.
You get yourselves gone as soon as your business is concluded.
Must be my Mexican blood.
That was the best TV show we could imagine.
I know! It was amazing!
Frank, it was terrible. Nothing happened.
Well, that's my biggest problems out the way. But I still have a bunch of smaller problems. Time for a lightning round. Well, I mean, it's not really a lightning round because it still takes forever to talk about them, so, you know, whatever. This is the 3rd episode in the series, and already the Doctor's moral stance on weapons is very muddled. The Doctor goes to great lengths telling Krasko how nasty his vortex manipulator is, only to tell Ryan exactly how it functions so he can use it against Krasko later on, essentially killing him by sending him to a prehistoric time period. You'd think there'd be some sort of lasting consequence for doing what he did? Yeah, you would think that. Despite the telling off the Doctor gave him in the last episode, Ryan isn't even left with a slap on the wrist or anything. Is the Doctor okay with this particular scenario because he didn't technically kill Krasko? Was it because Krasko was a racist? Yeah, those robots in the last episode may have wanted the gang dead, but at least they weren't aiming specifically for the black guy. When the Doctor confronts Krasko for the second time to discover what his plan is, she never shuts up. Instead of respecting the audience's intelligence, she spells out every little detail about Krasko, just by looking at what he's wearing.
You sent all your equipment to goodness knows where. 79th century, judging by the weapon setting, which, by the way, overheat very easily. Keep them listening. On your wrist, it's a Stormcage identifier, the most secure prison facility this side of the universe. Not in this time zone, of course. I guess that's where the vortex manipulator comes in. And it was nasty enough that Stormcage placed a neural restrictor in your brain before releasing you back into the universe.
How can you know that?
I got a scan of this. I thought I detected it the first time we met, and then it started to make sense because we were wondering, you obviously got a problem with Rosa, why don't you just kill her? But the answer is, because you can't. Neural restrictor means you can't kill or injure any living thing. It stops you from doing it, no matter how much you want to try. So even if I did this, smash your vortex manipulator. Yeah, there it is. Kicking in, time to break chemistry. You can't harm me, as much as you want to. Better be nice and use my best chance getting out of this time zone now. Neutered criminal.
How can you know that?
It's like the Sherlock scan from the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies, except she's saying everything out loud and doing it in real time.
First, distract target and block his blind count with cross left line discombobulated. Identify the elbow with watch block for left. We can right block, fracture, break correctly from so dislocate your entire you kick diaphragm. In summary, I am Iron Man.
Even when she's being strangled, listening to her perpetual deductions is so aggravating. Instead of information being shown to us in a way that's creative, the writers decide that it's better for the Doctor to blast out information at such a pace that it becomes overwhelming and makes the scene go on for much longer than it's needed. The very beginning of the episode had a couple nice songs from the 1950s to help immerse you in the time period. But that's really the only time a soundtrack like this is present. It might have helped the episode stand on its own if they had incorporated more music from the time period. They, don't do that. The way the Doctor behaves in front of Rosa Parks when she meets her for the first time doesn't feel, well, like the Doctor. She behaves like a tween girl meeting a member from her favourite boy band in the supermarket.
You all together?
Yes, we're very grateful, Miss...
Mrs. Parks, Rosa Parks.
No way.
You're kidding.
Brilliant!
Rosa Parks. Lovely to meet you, Rosa Parks. Big fan.
Excuse me?
Big fan of Montgomery. We are just visiting. Recommend anything for tourists like us?
I recommend.
For fans who have been watching the previous series, this feels totally out of character for the Doctor. The Doctor isn't the sort of character that gets so surprised to the point of stuttering in his speech. At least not for something like this. It would be much more appropriate for the Doctor to be kind and respectful when meeting a person like Rosa, rather than starstruck. Subtle admiration is a much more appropriate approach for a character as commanding and mysterious as the Doctor.
That proves it. Absolute genius. Who are you, exactly? More to the point, who is your delicious blackamoor lady?
What did you say?
Oops, isn't that a word we use nowadays? An Ethiop girl, a Suave, a Queen of Africa?
Can't believe I'm hearing this.
Political correctness gone mad.
Even his more bumbling incarnations would seem out of character if they were acting like 13 is here. And if the Doctor was such a big fan of Rosa Parks, like she so claims to be, being a time traveller, you'd think she'd already gone back in time to see her in some way. The Doctor asks the gang for information on Rosa Parks, which Graham is able to assist with, because he states...
She attends. Also, the name of the driver she refused.
I know that. It's James Blake.
How'd you know that?
Well, your nan, when she found out I was a bus driver, said to me, "You better not be like James Blake. Blake the Snake." That's what she called him. I had to ask her who he was, and she just said he gave all bus drivers a bad name.
Okay? I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I appreciate their attempt to make Grace involved, despite her not being around. Due to Grace's strong connection with Graham, she's still with them in spirit. On the other hand, it's a big coincidence that the first thing Grace ever says to Graham is exactly what the Doctor just asked for. Not only that, but what about Grace that we've seen by this point? Is there that suggests she's a massive fan of Rosa Parks? Is it because she's... black? Like the alleyway scene, it feels like the writers just made up a character trait on the spot because the episode called for it, not because of who she is as a person. I guess all I can say is that, at least, Rosa Parks was briefly brought up again in a future episode. Also, Graham failed to mention to the Doctor and gang that Grace liked frogs. Just thought I'd mention that. When the Doctor is giving an inspirational speech to the gang, she stops mid-speech to randomly tell Ryan to put Krasko's weapon down, only for her to tell him exactly how it works, and then throw it away. It's all edited like it was filmed and shoved right in the middle of this particular scene. Why? Well, I know why it was for this to happen. I think this is the sloppiest execution of forced exposition I have ever seen. Probably.
I wasn't there a second ago.
No kidding.
It was there. We just couldn't see it. Perception filter.
Why would anybody do that to a suitcase?
Why? Why would you do this to a suitcase? Why?
Later on in the episode, Yaz has a nice talk with Rosa and foolishly says she's a police officer. And Rosa is...
Yo, police?
Yeah.
okay with that? Rosa Parks, a member of the civil rights movement, is okay with a person who works for the organisation that enforces the law she opposes. She even questions Ryan about that kind of thing beforehand. What is wrong with this episode? Why is there so many questionable oversights in this episode? After rewatching this episode a few times, I thought it was overall solid despite its flaws, but the more I think about all the details, the more things just don't add up, and it really takes me out of it all. Was there anything I liked? I thought the scene with Graham, Ryan and James Blake was pretty funny. That's about it. At the end of it all, I'm finding that the core of the biggest problems stem from the failure to properly develop our two main guest characters, Krasko and Rosa Parks. The plot is built around the real-life actions of the latter character, but what good is a character-driven story if you don't get to know a lot about who they are? To reiterate, the deeper motivations of both these characters aren't very well explained at all. For Krasko, we know so little about him that we practically have to guess what he's actually trying to accomplish, but the strong implication that he's travelled back in time to prevent the Montgomery bus boycott and make sure black emancipation doesn't happen for thousands of years is baffling. The idea that Rosa Parks' protest was the only protest that would ever happen is absurd. We already see she's part of a network of other black rights campaigners, including Martin Luther King. Do none of them have any ambition? Or are we meant to believe that they just decide to pack it in because one of their own walked home one night instead of getting the bus? Such a leap of logic could work for a villain if they were depicted as uninformed or crazy. But in what little we see of Krasko, he's intelligent enough to time travel, he's cunning, he's resourceful, and he is as boringly emotionless as a villain can get. There is nothing that shows us he is unstable enough to actually decide to go forward with this ridiculous plan. And then there's Rosa. I've already talked about how the episode is a lot more interested in what she did rather than who she was. But in doing that, the episode ends up undermining what she did. The history of the Rosa Parks incident is debated. One version says that her act of defiance was spontaneous, and another says that it was planned and deliberately staged. The episode chooses to depict the former version of events, and that's fine, but it comes across as unconvincing given that Rosa Parks herself isn't at all prominent when you think about it. Although the episode shows her as part of the Black Rights Network, it still depicts her as an ordinary working woman, mostly just trying to get by despite the hardship she faces. I get that this was an attempt to get the episode to show that ordinary people can do great things, but it misses the mark. Why? These four. The Doctor and gang are far more active in the plot than Rosa, by far. They know there's an external threat and they do everything they can to make sure history stays on track. That's nothing new in itself. But unfortunately, in this case, it means that Rosa Parks gets the short end of the stick. The whole thing is about time travellers trying to get Rosa Parks on the bus where she needs to be at the right time. But since, from all we can gather about Rosa's attitude, the episode accidentally presents her as a pawn rather than a revolutionary. It's the Doctor and her companions that spend the second half of the episode plotting, scheming, manoeuvring, essentially spying on Rosa Parks, and ultimately manipulating her into being whatever place they need her to be in. And at the end, she gets arrested for it. That's the best word for it. Rosa Parks is just a pawn in the Doctor's game. If Krasko is the obstacle, then Rosa Parks is the MacGuffin. The episode wants to sing her praises and celebrate the good she did for the world, but at the same time it accidentally presents all that was being masterminded by four time-travelling liberal Democrats who are naturally led by a white person. Whoops. If all this isn't an example of unfortunate implications, I don't know what is. Sure, they got good intentions, and we know why they're doing it. But are their methods ethical? Because this is manipulative, however you look at it. Do the ends fully justify the means? As a character study, this episode completely fails, because if it's character-driven, and your character is undeveloped, then your story is full of holes, which can lead to this kind of situation. This doesn't feel like it's Rosa Parks' story, and in an episode named after her, that's a problem, especially as we head into the climax. So, after Krasko tries to sabotage the bus timetable, he and the TARDIS crew engage in a quick back and forth as they try to nudge history in different courses. It's actually a neat concept, with two factions of time travellers trying to constantly one-up each other as the event they're competing over draws nearer and nearer. It's actually a concept that could work well as its own episode, say with the Master or the Meddling Monk, but since it's relegated to the build-up to the climax, here it's pretty short. Finally, the Doctor and gang find themselves on the fateful bus and realise that they're going to have to be the passengers to whom Rosa has to give up her seat. It's a neat idea in itself, sourced by the gang's previous manipulation of Rosa, and also the expository dialogue doesn't help. Yaz has to rub it in case you're too stupid to understand what's happening.
We were here. We're part of the story.
We were here. We were part of the story.
So, James Blake demands that Rosa Parks give up her seat and move to the coloured seating at the back of the bus. Here and now, Rosa finds herself faced with a momentous choice. And she says, "Nay!" And then...
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round.
What are you doing?
What are you doing?
What do I even say about the song? Why, in a story this flawed, do the writers think having an inspirational pop song was at all appropriate to end the episode with? Not only is it completely out of left field, overwhelming to everything else in the scene, and the most condescending the series gets to its audience, it is strongly undeserved. We are 3 episodes in on the series, and we barely know anything about this Doctor or these characters, and we've barely learned anything about who Rosa Parks is as a person. This clearly isn't enough to get me invested in these characters to make me feel anything other than pandered to in this scene. The song itself is completely unnecessary. In fact, it lessens the impact of the scene. Why has this episode spent its full runtime beating us over the head with how important the Rosa Parks incident is, only to decide it needed a loud, over-the-top ballad to highlight how important the events we're seeing plat out are? Had the scene have had no soundtrack at all, or even a basic, more subtle score, this wouldn't be a problem. In fact, it could have been 100 times more powerful if the climax of episode 9 is anything to go by. But due to this choice of music, it signifies to me that they think the audience wouldn't know how to feel without it. Supposedly, this is an anthem that's been adopted by the Black Lives Matter movement, which makes it relevant to today. That's debatable, and it shouldn't matter anyway. It's still overkill. Furthermore, what's the point in hiring a new composer after more than a decade if you're just going to do this at what's meant to be your episode's defining moment? I've watched this episode multiple times, and not once when I got to this scene have I not rolled my eyes in bitterness. Last thing I need is a show that doesn't know what its own stance on weapons is to tell me to feel sorry for a character it failed to tell me anything about getting arrested. It doesn't even stop there. Right after this scene, we cut to the Doctor and gang in the TARDIS, standing in the most unnatural of positions, except for the diamond pose we saw earlier, listening to the Doctor drone on about how good a person Rosa Parks was. They named an asteroid after her, and Bill Clinton gave her a medal. Maybe they should have an episode where the Doctor and gang go back in time and meet Bill Clinton. It's less like the companions learned anything, and more like the Doctor's a school teacher pushing her obsession of a single person onto bored and confused children. And it doesn't end there either. The credits roll, and that song is still going. Stop! I get it. You don't have to shove your super inspirational anti-racist agenda in my face. I get it! You even have the song run through the next thing trailer. Why? Who thought this was a good idea? Who watches the climax of this episode and doesn't feel either condescended or pandered to? Whew. That was intense. Funny story, I was planning this video to be a short one, but because the series of Doctor Who is written by impotent individuals, I keep finding more and more stuff worth bringing up. It's not like I could just talk about one or just mention one scene and then say that's good or bad. No, I have to actually go into detail with everything because nothing makes sense, and I have to try and make sense out of all of it. When I ask questions about a certain scene, it just doesn't make sense when I try to... And, you know, whatever. No bingo this time. I got the bingo in the next episode. For the record, I count Krasko as a minor role because he's absolutely worthless. I count Rosa as a major role because flippin' heck, they tried what they didn't try with her. They both have the same problems. I don't know. I'm off script now. This is the end of the review. I'm done for this one. I have episode 10 left after this. Yay for me. Jeez, I don't know where to go with this.